Hi, my name is Joe Cernik. I'm a member of the faculty here at Lindenwood University, and I'd like to welcome you to Insight. Now, Insight is a show where we normally discuss books on politics, both domestically and internationally. Sometimes we discuss books that are historical to provide a perspective on the present, and sometimes broader atmospheric or trend analysis books to put political issues in a broader setting. Today's book does address foreign affairs, American foreign policy in some way. It's written by a man named Robert Kagan. He's written quite a few books, and he's a member of the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C., and the title of his book is called The World America Made. Now, joining me on the show today are two Lindenwood University students. To my immediate right is Jacob Bauer, and to Jacob's right is Madison Liddle. And we're going to start by me reading a quote, and then we'll jump into a discussion of the book. The author writes, "We take a lot for granted about the way the world looks today, the widespread freedom, the unprecedented global prosperity, and the absence of war among great powers. There's plenty wrong with our world, of course, but from the perspective of thousands of years of recorded history in which war, despotism, and poverty have been the norm, and peace, democracy, and prosperity the rare exceptions, our own age has been a golden era. Perhaps the progress we enjoy was not an inevitable evolution of the human species, but rather the product of a unique and perhaps fleeting set of circumstances."
I mean, I think it's kind of both course of nature and then, intervention from leaders around the world and making the world that we have today. The book's definitely an interesting kind of read and take on, foreign policy of America and the world we're in. But I don't know if it's really realistic. It kind of leads on to a lot of hypotheticals and what ifs. And I don't know how much kind of stake they really have.
Sure. I think this quote's a great opener for this book. It definitely describes a lot of what the book is about as far as what would happen if America hadn't become this great superpower that it is today. I do agree with you. I think a lot of the book was really general. I think it was a very short book, so it's hard to get into specifics in that. There's definitely essays that have been written about this. If you do online research, you can find other things that he's expounded upon. But I think this quote really opens up the topic.
And there's points where he does make good references to relations with China and Russia,
sure,
and their role in the future. But he is kind of vague in many parts throughout the book on kind of what he's hinting at or what he think may or may not happen.
Well, I think what he was trying to do is sort of say, well, someday we're going to talk about America decline, whatever that exactly means, whether or not you suddenly no longer see it as the preeminent superpower in the whole world, or whether or not you now think about it as, okay, it's still a major power, but now several other countries are on something of a par with it. So what does that mean? And so this quote he has, "It is worth exploring to what degree the present world order depends on American power and its unique qualities. What would it mean for the future if the international order were no longer shaped primarily by the United States and like-minded allied nations?" And so he's simply trying to say we can't, and maybe there's a modesty there, we can't keep assuming that we're the top of the heap forever.
Right.
That at some point change occurs. What happens then?
Right, and the hope there that he later says in the book is that the good parts of the influence that America has brought to the table will remain. The prosperity that has come, the democracy that's spread, and the peace that's happened among the major nations. There hasn't been a major war in 50 plus years, he points out. And the hope is that if America does decline, that those things will remain. But what happens if it doesn't? What happens if that turmoil does occur?
And he kind of references that too, how much peace he has, and he says just because we've had that long of peace without major powers going to war doesn't mean we should think that that won't happen again. Because he references to World War I, there was 40 years of kind of peace before that, and they kind of thought with the turn of the century, that with the weapons they had and like the prosperity they were enjoying, that war like that wouldn't happen. And then they had like the worst war we've ever seen at that time. So.
Yeah, his other quote, "The world is too big for any one nation to shape by itself. Nevertheless, in any given historical period, the most powerful nations do put their own peculiar stamp on the international order." So we've had some impact, and he's trying to figure out, well, how do we look at this? And I think this reference in the opening quote, is this a fleeting set of circumstances, a pretty good one in the sense of saying, how is there some design, even if that design wasn't always deliberate, it happened because of, as opposed to it just, there was some degree of evolution that was taking place here, and inevitably that's where we are today, as nobody did anything, just happened.
Yeah, I mean, like, we see with the British, kind of like the role of who kind of shapes the world, like before America kind of picked up that torch, it was the British Empire. They kind of had their influence kind of shaping the world around them, and after the world wars, that kind of declined, and we picked up that responsibility, whether we wanted to or not. And, for like the past decades, we've been having our influence everywhere, kind of like all over the world, whether like we ourselves like kind of now if we think that's good or not. So
sure, and I think it's important to point out that America's only been an established country for a little over 200 years. It hasn't had the long-lasting impact that a lot of these other nations have had. England, China's been around for as long as civilization at this point, and so it's important to realize that these are fleeting circumstances. I mean, America hasn't been around for the time frame that everybody else has had, and these circumstances, we're still kind of growing into them more than anything, and eventually we might fall out of them.
He refers to the United States, or rather American people. He says they have a Greta Garbo effect or belief, which is, I want to be left alone. Mm-hmm. And he says, and that's our national mythology, that mm-hmm. none of that is true, even though we want to get this impression, that we're not involved in anything and we're over here and you people are all on your own. No, he's not, none of that's true. We're involved in everything.
Like, especially 100 years ago, we kind of like thought ourselves as isolationists, and we didn't want to get involved with like European politics and like the war. But I mean, even before that, we had Manifest Destiny, westward expansion. We were in the Philippines, and the Monroe Doctrine with our sphere of like Western influence. We didn't want like Europe and stuff coming in over and having any say with like Latin America and all that. But we thought we had that right as a nation. And so this whole idea of us being like sticking to ourselves and not like going out there, that's not true.
Yeah, his quote, "While it's sincere of us to believe it, it's not true. It bears no sense to reality. Since the late 19th century, when the United States became a world power, Americans have used force dozens of times, and rarely because they had no choice." And so in this sense, he's talking about our involvement in Mexico and Central America. He's going on in our involvement in the Philippines at the beginning of the 20th century. And so he's going on in various says to say, no, look at how we've been involved.
And even forcing trade with Japan and China.
Yeah.
Sure, and there's actually a quote in there as well that he calls us the reluctant sheriff. We seem to have this persona that, we're going to be around to take over if anybody gets in trouble, but we don't really want to, which when you look back at the actions that of even the last 100 years, America's stuck their nose in a lot of different issues that probably didn't have the business of being in, but we see the self as the sheriff of sorts that we need to impose ourselves in situations where we see that injustice is being had.
Well, that issue of impose, it's sort of like one of the things he also brings, it sort of says like other countries in some ways have accepted. Mm-hmm. And as a result, he's saying, isn't that odd that they're sort of just willing at times to go along with us and sort of agree, okay, you're making some policy decisions and they're having an impact on the rest of the world, and what do you know, we're going along and we're not always fighting it. And so that doesn't mean it's sort of constant benevolent acceptance, but at times he sort of is saying this is, and then he gave a few examples.
Sure, and of course it states in the book that since 1941, in that year there was only 12 democracies in the entire world, and now there's upwards of 100. which a lot of that can be attributed to the fact that the most dominant superpower in the world right now is a democracy, which is largely what he attributes that change to. So I think you can make the argument as well that countries are looking forward to that prosperity that the Americans seem to have, and hopefully that their influence will be able to bring to their countries as well.
And you said like the countries go along with it, but and they do, but at what cost? You know, he states in the Iraq War in 2003 that 38 other nations like joined us. He kind of leaves out, you know, that it didn't have like a great impact. Like a lot of other nations, like they might have joined us, but it's not like they were gung ho about it. And you know, their kind of favorability, like of us, it's gone down. Like the eyes of us and like other people, we're not really that well liked, especially now.
I had the feeling he was bringing that up as a contrast with Russia and China. In other words, he was trying to say, if you look at the way the United States goes to war, we try to line up a whole series of allies before we go to war, which is in contrast with how Russia and China go to war. They don't bother about lining up allies to go to war on their side. And so how does this sort of perception of how we want to go to war look different from our point of view, and maybe the world we're having an impact on than is the case of Russia or China?
But he also adds, though, that, you know, we have these allies that go with us, but even when they object to military action, we'll still do it ourselves, like without them. And I think that's kind of important because, so.
A lot of countries operate in fear around us more than anything, especially the smaller countries that we seem to go into. And we have good intentions with them, but a lot of them aren't going to fight back out of fear, or fear and a combination of the hope that maybe we might bring something good to the table for them.
His statement on Americans. Americans in foreign policy are torn to the point of schizophrenia. They are reluctant, then aggressive, asleep at the switch, then quick on the trigger, indifferent, then obsessed, then indifferent again. And so this sort of, it's a book that was written prior to Donald Trump becoming president, and Trump seems to be wanting to become somewhat, I would say, isolationist or detached from the rest of the world, and will only be involved if you're on our terms at home. And so you're seeing some of that in this sort of current Trump presidency, this schizophrenia going back and forth.
Yeah, and we see that also with the Arab Spring and a lot of the Middle East. Like our foreign policy, we support some revolutions, and then others we don't. We support like the regimes and dictators, and it just seems like we go back and forth, and we don't sometimes stick to commitments we make, and then other times we don't even make a commitment, and then we just go in.
Sure, and a lot of that can be attributed to the change in administration. I mean, you see a lot of that big difference in change when there's a difference in political leaders at that time, difference in presidents, who's in charge of the Congress at that time. There just seems to be that difference that you can definitely tell. And there's definitely sways during the administrations, but you can definitely see that in that 4-year period, there's a lot of difference when you go back and look at it.
He was talking about Japan. So, okay, we defeated in the Second World War, but once the war is over, and he says it's like Germany, we don't see either one of them go back to the aggressiveness that they exhibited in leading into the Second World War. So then he was trying to point to this as examples of saying, so we're trying to figure out how this has positive impact on the world around, and so they're trying to figure this out in terms of relationship of the United States to Japan, Japan to China. So how are we going to look at that in what he's seeing as the rise of China? One of the sections in the book, certainly.
Yeah, because with Japan and Germany, he goes on about how they were demilitarized after the war, in which they were, and so it gave them focus. It changed their focus from war and power to like building themselves up, and they're two like wealthiest nations kind of in the world.
Sure, and you definitely see the impacts of Germany's demilitarization all the way through today. Yeah. I mean, they're still rebuilding themselves. They still haven't fully come back from that, and so you have to look at the impacts of that and what role America played in that.
And I mean, most recently, I think Japan still relies on American military, but I think that's changing. But yeah.
Well, again, his sort of a theme he retained, so he goes, there was nothing inevitable. Democratic progress and liberal economics have been and can be reversed and undone. considering the ups and downs of democracy in just the last 2 centuries, there's no assumption that everything as it is now will stay the way it is. And so he's simply trying to sort of look, okay, so we've got some impact. It just didn't come about. And so again, he's simply trying to put it into this perspective. It's logical questions. Assume that we're not going to stay up here, and there's got to be some rising up of other powers at some point, and these powers have an impact on how you change looking at the world around you.
Sure, and I think you also have to juxtapose that with another statement that he made where he said that Americans are so afraid of the decline that they're going to commit preemptive suicide of their own superpower because they're so afraid of this decline that hasn't seemed to happen yet. And that's not to say that it won't happen, but he is stating that, you know, Americans seem to have this idea that we're on this rapid decline, and that could cause the decline that they're so afraid of.
He, I think he sort of in some ways ties economic growth to sort of the growth of democracies. So that he's looking at the period from, I think, the early 1970s through the period at the end of the 20th century. So then he's talking about there's a sudden growth of democracies in the world that weren't there before. I think his number was 120 new democracies. And he sort of felt they came about because of economic growth. And so as a result, then you say, well, this is why he's looking and reflecting and sort of thinking. He refers to the idea of the Great Recession, which we ended up having, say, around roughly around 2008. And so this wasn't just an American thing, but a global thing. And as a result, then we can't assume that this will stay as it is. Again, the ups and downs of countries may be becoming democratic and not becoming democratic.
I mean, because he goes on about kind of like China's rising role in their economy and how like big it's become, but he does point out, though, you know, just because the state has a lot of money doesn't mean its people do.
Yeah.
And that goes into the prosperity of like the nation and the world. He kind of still states that, you know, America and Europe still hold over like 50% of the world's wealth. And he said, you know, even 20 years from now, China may like, the economy might become even bigger, but its GDP will still be less than that of Americans.
Sure, and I think that's a very important statement to make because Americans do hold a lot of wealth. As much as we like to talk about the poverty that's there, and it certainly is, we hold a large majority of what the world has to offer, and so our influence has become that much bigger. I mean, look at China and how much they outsource to us, and compared to what we take to them, they're selling stuff to us, and that's what's bringing money into their country. But for us, we're buying and buying and buying, and so a lot of that wealth is staying within us, and we're bringing it back to ourselves.
Well, I think that's to some extent he's trying to bring up China as the contrast. We're saying, okay, you're looking at China becoming wealthier, more powerful, but it's a different way than we look at the American system. If we're having some impact on the world, isn't it inevitable to assume that the way they look at themselves, that will also have an impact on the world around them? Here they are, they're not democratic, so that if our version of democracy had some sort of an impact on maybe bringing about some of these countries becoming democratic, becoming economically prosperous in certain ways of prosperity, but now you're looking at China and they're not democratic, and their concentration of money is very focused, even more so than we might talk in the United States about economic inequality, but that it appears to be significantly worse in China. How would that have an impact on the world around us?
Yeah, because he goes on throughout the book about China and Russia and their authoritarian kind of like governments compared to democratic governments around the world. And it'd be interesting to kind of like see what he thinks about it today. I mean, it's not that old of a book, but recently China's done away with its presidential term limits. And you know, he kind of alluded to that in the book, that you know, he thinks that the state would try and hold on to as much power as it can. And no doubt Vladimir Putin's going to win his presidential election again. So it's interesting to see like that continuation of China and Russia's role compared to the United States in the world.
Yeah, because those two countries weave through the book in contrast to the
Yeah.
United States. And so you're assuming, well, in some way, we're having an impact through whatever our values, our belief, our behavior, our actions. So why don't we assume they'll have one too? And they have to be able to permeate other countries.
Right. It's not like we haven't seen their impact before. I mean, China's been the dominant power in Asia. Russia's been the dominant power in Europe entirely. And the United States has been the dominant power in North America and is also spread to South America and all the other sides of the world as well. So it's definitely important that you realize that the three countries that he picked to write this book based around are the three major superpowers that have taken hold of this world in the last 100 years, and so that definitely plays a major role into how this book functions and the different contrasts that he makes.
Again, with this notion of evolution versus particular circumstances, he says, it is a common perception today that the international free market system is simply a natural stage in the evolution of the global economy. And then he's saying, maybe we shouldn't think that way. That as a result, if China and Russia are not quite seeing it, but that we are, and we had a bigger impact now, why don't we assume at some point whatever perceptions they may have, they will have an impact on other countries. And
Yeah.
so, but I mean, so, in other words, he's simply trying to point out, I think it's inevitable that you're saying, okay, a basic question, because it weaves through the book, is, at what point does the United States see a decline? And the decline is more a relative thing. It's not necessarily absolute, but some of the decline may also be us being maybe more withdrawn for longer periods of time.
Sure, and that's certainly been the fear of a lot of administrations, is that we don't want to isolate ourselves so much that we become this pillar of that just stands alone, and especially because we're geographically separated from most of the other prominent countries in the world, we do have to make sure that we're still reaching out. And if we do create this isolationist kind of mentality, what kind of impact is that going to have on the Europes of the world that don't have quite the same industrial power or global economy that impact that we do?
His references to the lead up to the First World War, which he called the Great Seduction, where we assume there would be no First World War, and then he's referring to different publications and attitudes and beliefs that people had, and as a result there's no way that a war will come about because of all the development of progress and all the development of countries, and then you have the First World War. So then as a result, it's things we think may feel very good about, let's call what he calls it the golden age now, but then how do you keep it and not sort of have that illusionary thinking?
Sure, and they certainly never saw World War I coming. I mean, no one expected that to just pop out of nowhere, like you said. Before that, there was years of prosperity where there wasn't any major global impact like that. And then World War I came, and then shortly thereafter, World War II came, and the world was devastated at the fact that there was so much peace before that. And now you see this great turmoil of a lot of nations that are trying to rebuild themselves, and America prospered after that in a lot of ways.
Yeah, he refers to a book called Norman Angell, 1910. The book was called The Great Illusion, and he says it sold more than 2 million copies in this time period. So here you are 4 years before the onset of the First World War, and as a result, what you're doing is even having Winston Churchill as a young member of Parliament, seeing those powers that have become interdependent upon others, interwoven by commerce with other states, would never threaten the tranquility of the modern world. And yet, as a result, you will have the First World War. So he's just trying to sort of address the idea of we can't make certain assumptions that things are sort of as they are and everything is going to be fine.
Yeah, I mean, we kind of create our own ideas of what the future will be and what it will hold, but that doesn't always necessarily mean it'll come true. And that's just throughout history.
Sure, and that comes back to the inevitability of, is America's decline inevitable or is the prosperity inevitable? And I think that he kind of makes the argument that it's neither. It's one of those things where we depend on other countries, they depend on us, and that whole set of circumstances that isn't really set is what's going to determine what happens.
He made an interesting quote I like. It said, American power also shaped Soviet behavior throughout the Cold War. The extent of the Soviet reach into Europe was determined by the disposition of military forces at the end of the Second World War, not by the modesty of Soviet ambitions. And so how we behave is going to have an impact on current-day Russia and China. And so there's this interrelationship. And so again, if you look at what does it mean if the United States sort of begins to act or behave or withdraw in different ways in the future, how is that going to affect Russia and China?
Sure. I mean, you definitely see that economically. If we start pulling out, what's going to happen to those countries? We have a large impact on the global economic structure as it is. And so if we start to move out of our current state, you know, what impacts is that going to have on countries that are more dependent on what we do?
Another quote, because again, it sort of indicates sort of the way he's looking. He says, people are right to point to the spread of democracy and the free market, free trade economic system as important factors in the maintenance of great power peace. Where they err is in believing these conditions are either sufficient or self-sustaining. And so again, what you're doing is raising sort of notions that maybe you have to consciously be aware of this just didn't happen, but how do we sustain it? How do we keep it going?
Yeah, and then kind of around the world, our influence is everywhere, and we seem to, like when the pieces start to fall, we seem to like try and catch them. And as he kind of calls us, the catcher in the rye. Like that's what we see our role as, instead of just letting things fall as they may. And that's how much of like history before, like what's led to our development and stuff. I mean, at the Civil War, if a European nation tried to like intervene and stop that from happening, I mean, how would have things turned out differently? Because I mean, there's times where more than times where we go into other countries and support up a regime or a dictatorship just so it doesn't fall.
Yeah. We only have a few minutes left. What do you think of the book, and how do you suggest it to the viewers?
I mean, like I said, I thought it was a very interesting read. It kind of gives you some insight and like thought about like what could happen, but I think that's a lot of what it is, just like what ifs. And at the end, he kind of even makes a question. He's like, you know, this might not happen, but it all kind of depends on what America does. And yeah.
Sure, I thought it was a very thought-provoking book. It's a short read. It's super easy to read. It's very narrative of sorts, so it's not like it's something that you're going to have to struggle through. You can sit and read it in one sitting if you really wanted to. But I thought it was an interesting perspective that he took. I think it's a topic that we don't talk about a lot in comparison to other nations. So I thought that the whole idea was really solid, and I'd like to see his perspective nowadays as it's progressed a little bit.
Yeah, I liked the book, and I was thinking that's an interesting series of questions to pose, that you're not just evolving, but that there's some work and design involved. And so, yeah, when I was reading the book, I was thinking it was written before Trump. I'm wondering if he would issue a new edition where how would I put a Trump presidency and a Trump approach to foreign policy in here. And does that help the future or hurt the future, or does he feel it doesn't make much of a difference? So in that sense, I'm just sort of wondering how he might update it.
Sure.
So thank you for joining us today.